Okay,
Yes.
good afternoon. I call the Iowa City Community School Board meeting on Tuesday, May 12th to order. My name is Janet Godwin. I want to thank those on Zoom for joining us tonight. Our introductions, I think I can't see you all, but I'm assuming you're there. Superintendent Steve Murley, Directors Lisa Williams, Paul Esper, Sean Eichen, Tina Malone, J.P. Cross, and Charlie Eastham, and Kim Colvin, Recording Secretary. If we have community comment this evening, folks are going to need to use the raise hand feature. And when you've been authorized to speak, you'll need to accept the request to activate your microphone, and you'll have 4 minutes to address the board. Please remember to state your name prior to speaking. There'll be a timer on screen. During community comment, persons may speak to the board about topics relevant to the district. All community comment directed at non-agenda items and agenda items shall take place at the beginning of the meeting during the community comment section of the agenda. And so our first topic that we have is our community comment. Do we have any folks that are looking to do community comment this evening? Any speakers tonight?
I don't see any hands raised.
It doesn't look like it, no.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you for that. It is, I'll just say again, nice to have that feature. If folks had wanted to comment, it's nice that we're able to enable that. I'm going to move on to agenda approval. Is there a motion to approve our agenda tonight?
I move that we approve the agenda.
Second.
Kim, we're ready to vote. And I'm going to be an aye.
Okay, online voting is open. Ruthina, I'm not getting yours.
Oh, it didn't pop up. Yes.
Thank you. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. On our consent agenda, any comments from directors reviewing the bills this period? Hearing none, I know that we would like to pull the, I think it's item 11, the Encompass Resolution LLC item. Are there any other items directors would like to pull? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve our consent agenda without item 11?
So moved. Second.
Second.
I wasn't sure who was second. It sounded like JP was first. I wasn't sure who turned in second.
I got Charlie a second. I think he came in.
Okay, good. Great. So, Kim, I think we're ready to vote.
Online voting is open.
Kim, I'm an aye.
Thank you, Janet. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. And so then for item 11, my understanding is that we are planning not to take action on this item tonight. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And Steve, there's nothing else we need to do other than to state for the record that we are not taking action on this particular item.
Nope, I would just note that the board met in closed session prior to the open session. The board had extensive discussion about the process underway. The board has asked and Attorney Holland has agreed to gather some additional information and disseminate that to the board, at which point in time the board will then reconsider the issue.
Okay, very good. So we will not act on this item this evening. Steve, thanks for that additional context. I think we can then move on to our first presentation. Les, I think you're up with the quarterly financial report.
Thank you, President Godwin. The quarterly report is presented in the board packet. I will, just a couple quick things of note, since it's through March 31st, it has very little of COVID-19 related expenditures. Anything that would be there, I pulled it in early April and we had about 12,000 of expenditures that was related to masks and disinfectant and some of those type of things. So there's no pandemic pay or anything like that reflected in those financials. And there's also no revenue from the CARES package that revenue is expected to come later this week to schools in Iowa. And so I would probably move your attention to the unspent balance page that's towards the end. And what I've done there is I've included everything for next year that's a known at this point in time. The CARES was not known at the time this was presented, so it's not included there as any projection for income. But what I have done is I have reduced next year's allowable growth, or this SSA, to 1%. It was previously 1.5% in previous quarter reports. So it's only there for presentation purposes to show you what the impact starts to look like as we move forward, as that SSA amount were to drop. I just was on a presentation with about 10 minutes before this meeting started, and they expect the Revenue Estimating Conference to meet later this month. And then that will be the precursor for what the legislature might do when they reconvene. And that's still to be determined at that date. So that will be the impact. The presentation that I saw said that they don't expect any impact on our current year, the 19-20 budget. Any action taken will be on the 2021 budget. So I don't know, Steve, if you've heard anything different from out of the governor's office or any of the meetings that you've been in, but that's the latest that I have related to any of the budget projections moving forward. The key is to listen to fact and try to keep the emotions out of it as best we can, and work with the known information. And at this point in time, there are not a lot of knowns, and so we have to continue to kind of just hang tight, and we'll work with administration and the board and present those as soon as they become available.
So again, I would just I would echo what Leslie said. I think that the key piece for us, and I know that the question has been asked before as we go through the budgeting process in relation to the state. Obviously, the state has rainy day funds, and the question was asked essentially, is our unspent balance a rainy day fund for us? And I would just remind you that the board's policy states that we want the unspent obligation to float between 5 and 10%, preferably closer to 5%, as we're not a bank. You can see from the numbers that are at the bottom of that sheet that we are moving in the right direction given the current allocation of funds from the state, but are currently not forecasted to move into that 5% range under this model. And so I think that that is very pertinent for you as you think about the work that we're doing on things like staffing at the elementary and the secondary level, and considering programming implications depending on our return to learn plan that we develop and prepare to roll out for the fall. One high point I would note for you is if you scroll back up a few slides up there on the bottom right-hand corner of, I believe it's page 4, you'd notice that the open enrollment trend is continuing to move in the right direction for us, both decreasing the number of students moving out and increasing the number of students moving in. And so a net move in the correct direction for us from a budgeting standpoint. I think that's directly attributable to the staff and the programming that we offer, and hopefully perhaps is something that we'll see as we move into next fall. So with that, we would certainly entertain any questions that you have.
I would share with the board that the amount of the CARES funding is projected to be 1.6 million. However, the way that the legislation is written, about 112,000 of that has to be shared with our non-public schools within the school district boundaries. And that allocation is a little bit higher than what normally is seen under a Title I, because the legislation was written such that all students get some sort of funding. So normally Title I doesn't cover high school students. So all of the Regina High School students are now receiving some funding for this program for those high school students. You may see numbers and stuff from across the state. So for example, Cedar Rapids and West Des Moines are going to have huge hits in that area when you throw a school the size of Xavier or Dowling into their mix, and you have to pull that allocation out. So you're going to see some discrepancies if you see any statewide numbers or any tables that show that. Iowa City's impact, as I indicated, is about 112,000 that will flow through. However, the district is required to make the expenditures on their behalf out of the 1.6 million, but then separately track that towards the non-public. So coming before you in future months, you will see expenditures that are actually made for Regina, for Willow Wind, for Heritage Christian, because of the way that those rules are in place. So please feel free to ask those questions if you see those, and we'll address them as they come up. The other action that we anticipate taking related to COVID-19 is FEMA applications. I've spent a couple hours with their state representative and have information presented to them to get reimbursement through the FEMA program. That is a program that is 75% federal funds, 10% state funds. So only 85 cents on the dollar that we expend there will be reimbursed via FEMA. And the expenditures that are eligible there are pandemic pay, cleaning supplies, and other things to mitigate that. No expenditures for budgeted employees are allowed. So none of the salaries for our nutrition folks other than their pandemic pay can go against that. No custodian, cleaning costs, or anything of that nature can be claimed there. So, and then since this isn't a natural disaster, which FEMA normally addresses, such as a flood or a tornado, there's very little from a structural perspective or heavy equipment that would be used to meet those emergencies. And so the dollar values are generally going to be smaller for a school district from a FEMA perspective. The pandemic pay will probably be our largest piece that we will claim as we move through that process, and we'll keep you updated as we make those reimbursement claims with them.
And I'll offer just one piece because you may want to keep an eye out for it, or you may see something about it from a political standpoint. Leslie mentioned the change in the formula distribution for those CARES Act dollars. And right now the Council of Great City Schools, which represents about 100 of the largest school districts in the country, is currently engaged with several state departments of education in filing a lawsuit against Secretary DeVos and the Department of Education for their distribution formula. Because they feel it violates the law as it pertains to Title I and its allocation of funding. So not that it'll have an enormous impact on us, but as Leslie said, it's certainly of great interest across the state and across the country.
Oh, Leslie, this is Charlie. Just very briefly, would Faith Academy be one of the schools locally that we would do some sharing with?
Yes, it is, Charlie. I'm sorry, I omitted those in my previous group, so thank you.
Oh, that's fine. Thanks very much.
Thanks for all this heads up, Les, on what we can expect to see going forward, and Steve too, update on potential lawsuits. Yikes, never dull moment, lots going on. Any other questions or comments for Les in the quarterly financial report? Okay, I think we can move on to our discussion items. We've got the first up is around the procedures for continuous learning update. Steve, are you going to take that?
I'll start and then I'll turn it over to the group. I think the thing that is probably paramount interest long term is the return to learn plan, and we'll come back to that at the end. And so let's take a look at some of the things that are happening today. From both teaching and learning and an operations standpoint. And I'll have Amy and Matt start with our teaching and learning update.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it just seems like we were just talking about this last week with the weekly updates. And so we're just kind of in a groove with the continuous learning, the required continuous learning high school and junior high, and continuing to deliver to as many students as we can, the best we can. In that regard, continue to try to have our building principals meeting frequently with teachers and meeting frequently with building principals to address any issues that come up around instruction, grading, questions or otherwise. And then of course now with an eye towards the end of the year and what that looks like. And I know Chase will cover some pieces about building access and kind of end of the year components that we're looking at, but we know that's fast approaching. And so that's been some time intensive work the last week. And then also with an eye toward graduation, you've seen a lot of districts making announcements around graduation. And we expect to have some information out by the end of the week in that regard about what some of our graduation plans will look like. And we've been actively meeting on that every week with our high school principals, and then they go back and work with their teams. And so I think you can expect to see some detailed information go out to families and parents about what those plans will look like. We just have some few last details to work through in that component, but I think you'll be pleased with it as it looks very similar to some of the other things you're seeing in the news from local schools or large districts in the surrounding area in that regard. So that's kind of the 30,000 feet overview. I know we've given a lot of details and information before. Like I said, teachers are continuing to try to connect with students and get them into classes and continue the learning the best we can. The return to learn piece, like Steve started with, it'll be really ramping up our planning over the next few weeks and trying to predict the unpredictable. And so some of that will be just planning the best we can with the information we have, and then acknowledging the need that we'll have to adjust and be flexible as we go throughout, because there's a lot we don't know for 3 months from now. So that'll be just a continual piece of work for us. Otherwise, I'll have Amy jump in, and then if some of the directors have any additional comments, we'll take those too.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening, everyone. At the elementary level, we continue with voluntary educational enrichment opportunities, working our 5 goal areas with connecting with students and families, access to Clever, Dreambox, Lexia, Newsela where applicable. And then in the last week, we've been rolling out our workbooks, and we had a second distribution opportunity last evening. And I'm pleased to announce that almost district-wide, we're almost around 90% of our families have come picked up workbooks for our students. So that's just phenomenal to be at that place. We're excited about that. So while we're excited about those statistics, we have seen in the last week our usage of Dreambox and Lexia fall off slightly. I think it could be perhaps because they're into the workbooks now. So we'd like to see both happening, of course, but we were at a high with students logging on at 64%. And last week we saw students using Dreambox at 58%. With Lexia, we've seen a high of 58%, and last week we were at 54%. We started to look further into those students then that are also meeting their weekly prescribed usage. Again, this is all voluntary, but just curious as to how many students are actually working in a product with their designated amount of minutes. And we're able to grab the Lexia percentages, and we're working on Dreambox. But of those 54% of those students who had logged on last week, 62% of them had met those weekly usage minutes, or suggested minutes anyway. So with that, I think we'd open it up to questions.
Matt, do you have any numbers on how many students chose to continue with education at the secondary level versus taking the pass option?
Not right now, Paul. You know, when grades are submitted, it'll be kind of the real key piece of that. It's class by class, and so that's the challenge about getting it in. You know, we allowed students that could take some classes. Some maybe decided to continue in all of theirs, and others may have decided to stop with a pass. And so, you know, when grades are submitted, we could give a rough breakdown about how many pursued it for a grade or how many took a pass option in that. But even students that maybe have elected to take their pass would still be engaging in the course potentially, even though they're not working for a grade. And so it's really hard to gauge an accurate number of that. I would say rough estimate from what we hear from principals is about 60 to 70% of their kids engaging in the course in that way, shape, or form. But again, that doesn't speak to it's only 60 or 70% of the kids, because one student might be in one class, 3 classes, 5 classes. And so it's hard to really accurately shoot that number for you that way. But I would say overall, and I'm not sugarcoating, I think we feel pretty good about the amount of kids that we've tried to reach and at least hear back from. Of course, we haven't heard back from everybody, but the efforts have continued week after week to try to hook them in. And so I think our real focus at this point is going to have to shift towards, some of those philosophical things we believe about in the fall when students enter our classes, and what we do to try to compensate for some lost learning time, and so that we don't resort to some structural things that'll happen to them or could happen to our students that would put them further behind. And that's where a lot of our advanced planning will focus on.
Matt and Amy, this is Charlie. I was at the Black Voices Project meeting last night. There was a considerable discussion among folks at that meeting about our efforts at including Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino students in our remote learning. As I understood the perspectives that were voiced were that people were thoroughly convinced that there's a good disproportionality in participation between white and Black and Latino students. And a bit more concerning to me, frankly, was that there's also a perspective that our efforts are not as strong towards including those students in remote learning as other students in remote learning. As I've said in the past, I try to take the perspective of not scolding or chiding any of you if you're doing work that's very difficult. But I think we should. I think as a board member, I need to voice that, and I hope as we go forward, those perspectives on the part, and these were all staff people, those perspectives will be modified to seeing a very even effort on our part to get all students participating in remote learning education.
Charlie, I'm not necessarily surprised by some of that. I would say we probably have a disparity in some of that participation. I think the challenge would be, especially if that's coming from our staff members, and I don't need to put Brady on the spot here, but I know he's one of our panelists for the meetings, would be what were the, I think we're open to any suggestions about how to continue to reach students and how to continue to encourage the participation. And so if there is something that, is a blind spot for us or something we should be doing that we're not doing, I think we'd want to hear that. And I guess the reason I'd bring Brady into it is just from his perspective, what he's also hearing from his direct colleagues on that feedback about who's participating and what that looks like. And if there's any parts we're missing that we could be doing or things we should be doing to try to encourage that we're missing, I think we'd want to know that, because I don't think we believe we have the lease on doing it right. I think we know that's one of the challenges through this COVID situation, is that our most structurally disadvantaged students are going to be at the highest risk for this experience. So Brady, I don't know if you have anything to add or not. You don't feel like you have to, but.
Sure, yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate that. And it's definitely been, at the forefront of people's minds as they've tried to figure out a way to communicate with families in a systematic way that's compassionate and empathetic, but at the same time direct, that we want all of our students, of course, to continue with their learning if they are willing and able. And I think that one of the things that we were probably struggling with in the very beginning was knowing how to do that effectively. We were getting feedback that families were maybe getting too many phone calls or too many communications that were too long. And so it was just overwhelming, and the messages were missed because we were all, we probably tilted a little bit and said, okay, let's run the communications through our counselors and our administrators and our SFAs, and see if we can't do that so that we have, you know, a simpler message that's accessible instead of overwhelming people with too many emails and too many messages that just confuse them. So I think, you know, I can see that perspective for sure. I mean, that is, this is one of the big profound challenges of remote anything is communication. And in just my personal anecdotal experience with my own classes, it has been interesting to see the things that I thought I was very clear about in multiple ways through multiple mediums that people were still completely missing. And, you know, it's really made me reflect, because you know, you have a pretty good system when you're working with kids one-on-one and you see them every day and, you know, their friends are there with them. It gets a lot more challenging when you have, you know, you don't have access to them face to face. And so I think that, Charlie, your perspective and the point of the BVP folks and the staff members is, you know, really well taken. I'll reach out and see if there's ways that we can do that better, because we need to do it better. And it's been a challenge. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I think that's hard to figure out how to effectively communicate in a way that not only is effective for us and simple for us, but that's also meaningful and, you know, produces the engagement levels that we want. I don't know if that answers it, but yeah, it's hard. I mean, it has been.
I think that just helps add perspective, Brady. And I would say the same thing. I mean, those staff members, we'd want to feel comfortable reaching out to us if they have ideas or suggestions to do that. We've tried to be really intentional about staff being part of the conversation and part of the solution, because we know that it takes multiple heads to put this together. And so we can definitely work to follow up and see what ideas or solutions they have as well. And because the thing that we have to be ready for is if we're in this type of environment again in any way, shape, or form in the fall, that we've accounted for those pieces. I mean, we were able to create a lot of flexibility and a lot of empathy in our model this time, you know, as far as grades and credits and things like that. You know, there's going to have to be a different look at it a little bit in the fall about what we expect and how to reach and how participation looks and some of those things. So as that continues to adjust, I think we'll want it to continue to adjust and refine our approach too.
I would be able to add. Yeah, you asked the question, I think it was in our meeting maybe 2 weeks ago, Charlie. And so Diane reached back to one of the people in our tech department to ask if we could get a breakdown of by race or just all of our different subgroups that we tend to monitor regarding logging in. So when I think about access, you know, that's one way for us to be able to see how many kiddos are engaging with us. And during the month of April, on some statistics, I'm not sure which date this was pulled, but we had 85% of our kids at the elementary had at some point logged into Clever. And Clever is the portal in which then they would get to and Dreambox. So if you think about 85% of our students overall, first of all, I think that's a fantastic number, not that we don't want to be at 100%, but I'll share the breakdown then with what it looked like across the subgroups. White students logged in into Clever at 90%, Black students at 77%, Hispanic 77%, Asian at 90%, free and reduced lunch 76%, IEP students at 73%, and ELL students at 79%. So definitely we see some disparity there, but overall I think those numbers are fairly healthy. Again, not that we don't want to be at 100% and certainly don't want to see any disparity between the groups.
Thanks, Amy. And I would interpret that as being numbers to build on and a good solid place to go forward for towards, right? And I really appreciate your bringing those numbers to the board.
Thanks to Diane for reaching back to Austin for that, and thanks to Austin for grabbing those for us.
I have a question on the return to learn plan.
Yes. So I was going to pivot to next. So that's perfect timing.
Well, Oh, well, perfect. Okay. So I logged on the DE website and I read through their return to learn plan summary and kind of the different tracks. And I haven't attended any webinars, so it's not making any sense to me. And I'm wondering if you all could kind of walk us through. It seems to me that we have a required track that we have to fill out. But it seemed to me that the required track is more like if we don't have any in-person school, like what that looks like. And then there's kind of a hybrid optional, and then there's a in-person, but then that the DE isn't going to approve those last two tracks. They're only going to approve for now the first track. And could someone make sense of this for us?
Certainly. So you're absolutely right. There's 3 different tracks that they're looking at, and there's a bit of a misnomer there because the one that is called required continuous learning might sound like what we're doing right now, which is required continuous learning. However, the required continuous learning that they're looking at for the fall is a far more robust model than what we have right now. And that is the presumption that if indeed, for some reason, we are not able to have students back in schools, that we need to be able to start the school year in an online learning environment, and that we need to take the lessons we've learned this spring and the time that we've got available to us over the summer, and really ramp up and push out a more robust model that's K-12. So right now, remember that we have required learning going on for students grades 9, 12, 8 and lower if they have a college, high school bearing class, credit bearing class. But right now our K-8 kids are in a voluntary mode for their continuous learning. And this would actually require us to have required continuous learning for all students K-12. So it's going to look different than what we have right now. So they've used the same terminology, but it's going to look a little bit different. That's the one that you have to do. And we'll have to have that template filled out and turned into the DE no later than July 1st. However, they rolled this out last Friday, and in the webinar with them today, and then the one last Friday, it's fairly clear that this is a compliance-driven model. And they're looking for assurances that the district affirms that we will follow Department of Education rules and state statutes, federal guidelines, and that if you're willing to stipulate that you're going to follow those, they are going to be very forgiving, or not forgiving, maybe the right word. They're going to give you a lot of latitude in developing your return to learn plan for required continuous learning. The other 2 are a hybrid possibility and an on-site delivery. I would argue that I think the on-site delivery is also a required one. I'm really hoping that at some point in time in our lives, kids are back in schools on a physical basis. And so I think we'd be remiss in not planning for a return to on-site delivery. And that's the 3rd option in there. And that's really important because I think that when you get into their template and then you start to look at the real details inside there, that is what most people are hearing about, whether it's on local or state or national news, when they're talking about what we're seeing in Europe and Asia as kids start to come back to school. What do the safety aspects look like? What does the social distancing look like? How does that impact school nutrition, transportation, those types of things? And so I think that that is going to require a great deal of depth of thinking on our part. And so we want to get working on that immediately. We've already started that process so that if at some point, either on or before August 23rd, or at some point between August 23rd and the end of the year, we do have kids physically back on campus, we are prepared for that and have worked through as many eventualities as we can. The one that lives in the middle is the hybrid learning option. And in the hybrid learning option, think of it as some kids being in school and other kids perhaps in a required continuous learning mode. If you're following Europe, you know that several countries have brought their youngest kids back first, presuming that the older children are better equipped to work in an electronic environment, and the younger kids more needing an in-person environment. We've also talked about the need to consider, and this goes to Charlie's earlier comment, kids who come to us with more needs and perhaps more challenges in our educational environment. You might think about our English language learners, our special education students, our students who are at risk, and that if we're going to bring some students at some grade levels back first, those might be the first students that we target for a return to on-campus learning. And so that hybrid model stipulates that you have some students on campus and some students off campus. And that could be, again, as we described in terms of by student population, or you could look at it from the standpoint of we only have enough physical space to bring half the kids in today and half the kids in tomorrow. So there's lots and lots of different models out there that we've looked at, but our obligation between now and July 1st, as you pointed out, Lisa, is to make sure that we have the required continuous learning plan up and ready to go. And then that we also look at the hybrid learning option and the on-site learning option, and we start doing our due diligence to have plans in place to accommodate students in either one of those models. So Amy, Matt, what else have you've sat through some of those delightful webinars with me? What else do we need to share before we throw it open for additional questions?
Yeah, I really think of it like a continuum, like Steve talked about, and really what we have to do, Lisa, or the rest of the board, is we have to prepare for all three, essentially, you know, and that we have to be able to know what we would do in each of those circumstances. And then there's kind of 7 key areas, if you've looked at any of those documents, that would pop up there to you: leadership, infrastructure, health and safety, academic standards, social emotional behavior, mental health, equity, and then data considerations. And so those are kind of like the big drivers. And then in their support document, there's all kinds of questions and things for us to think about and account for. And of course, some of that work we've done already, right? We've already considered some of those things. We've already accounted for some of those pieces in our model. But that is a nice guidance document for us to think about in all 3 of those situations. What would this look like and how would you deliver on it? Because at any one point, you know, we might need to shift from one model to another. And so I think the plan, you know, really is to account for all 3 of those, to try to work through each of those 7 components, to talk to you guys about what our best work is to date. And then really the piece in the July 1st is, like Steve said, a kind of a compliance component with some assurances about in any of those 3 options, we're assuring we'll be able to deliver on those pieces. So that's kind of the high level overview, or the understanding I'd have, or that I'd share with you, you know, before you look at some more of those specifics in each of those components. But Amy probably has a couple other things here too.
The only thing I would add is the DE did a nice job of offering just a question and answer at today's webinar, and there's still going to be other guidance that's forthcoming from the Department of Ed, and they're just working as fast as they can on it. And it's things related to, of course, what we need as far as PPE and transportation, what to look like. So they got that out, this piece out to us, but will continue to feed us other information as it's available and they're ready to release it.
Thanks, Amy. This is Janet. Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Sorry, I was just curious. I mean, as we're developing these various plans, are we planning to get some parent or community or like Black Voices Project or DPO? I mean, do we have a process in mind for gathering feedback from and input from our key stakeholders, parents, you know, guardians, folks, you know, support teams, you know, I mean, just that we're back to that earlier conversation that we're finding a way to meet the needs in these hybrid and remote situations so that we can address them. And maybe the return to learn plan doesn't have to get that specific, but I feel like we should get community feedback on some of these plans, because I mean, the kids are not physically in school. We're doing, you know, some on, some off. I mean, whatever the social distancing rules are going to be, it's going to be impactful and disruptive to families. And I just was wondering if you all thought about how to gather community input on these scenarios that you're putting together.
Yeah, Janet,
That's
I think
a great question, and we had. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just going to say, we've thought about, when I listed off those 7 different components and then the 3 overall models, I think, you know, as we try to think about how to team and how to structure this, it really talks about in those 7 different components, then who are the relevant stakeholders to bring into each of those conversations. So I think that's critical for the work in each of those areas. And then it's kind of, you know, Steve always likes to think in spreadsheets or in grids. And so when you do think about it like a spreadsheet or a grid with the three models and then the 7 areas of each, when you line that out, you know, in a grid and you think about how you'd account for each of those 7 under the 3 models, then I think that's where we bring in that stakeholder input in those groups to say, okay, what are the things we're missing, or those blind spots like we talked about that Charlie was mentioning, that you hear from staff, community groups about how to account for that. And so we have some work to do internally to wrap our heads around it and to know what some options are. And then of course, part of that is, you know, not doing it alone. We can't do it in a vacuum, and we have to know what's right for our community and what fits.
Okay. That helps. And just, I mean, I know July 1st seems like it's far away, but it's like around the corner, and just, you know, even getting, you know, some forums scheduled or whatever the proper venues are, just making sure that we leave ourselves enough time to get the input and react and respond as necessary to refine the plan before we actually submit it on July 1st. So,
and I know Lisa, maybe Sean had a question. I know Lisa and Sean had a question too, but maybe just a quick point for you on that one, Janet. Based on the webinar with the DE last Friday and the one today, what they're really requiring us to do by July 1st is to provide those assurances that we are going to follow state law, federal law, that we're going to follow the DE mandates. And so that actually gives us a little bit of latitude because, as you said, July 1st is really kind of right around the corner. And to try to convene those groups in such a short period of time and to have to do it telephonically or over Zoom, which might make it difficult for some of our populations of people to participate. We actually have some space in order to do this work between now and the start of the school year, because while we have to provide the assurance to the DE but by July 1st, we have the month of July to continue our planning process. So I know there were a couple other questions. I know Lisa had one and Sean might have had one.
Well, so my question, I just like at a 30,000 foot view, is what you're telling us that by July 1st, we're going to have a plan in place for the scenario where no one is allowed back in the school, the scenario where everyone is allowed back in the school, and a hybrid mix of we can have in-person education happening, but it looks different than it looked in February.
We will have that in place by August 23rd. By July 1st, what we will have in place, by the way, that's a Sunday, so we can't start school till Monday the 24th. What we'll have in place by July 1st is an understanding of the assurances that we have to agree to fulfill in order to comply with the DE's rules. They were pretty clear with us in the webinar, and I didn't finish listening to the entire one today because I was in another webinar at the time. But last Friday, they were pretty clear that we will be able to check off the assurances that say we're going to, for instance, we're going to provide appropriate instruction for our English language learners. But how we do that is a local decision. And now we have, not only from now until July 1st, but also from now until August 23rd to say, okay, if we're going to allow some students back in, are those students at a higher priority than perhaps non-ELL kids who can take, as Charlie said, better advantage of our online learning options if they're at home learning? And so we've got a couple of months to continue to work on that. We're obviously not going to wait till July 1st, but we don't have to have that locked down by July 1 in order to provide the assurances. Does that help? I don't know if I'm explaining it well.
That does help. I mean, one of my concerns is that the state sets as a requirement, you must provide in-person education. And we as a community are not at a point where we feel that we safely. And so I don't know how that's going to marry up with each other.
No, no, that's a great point. What the state is saying is that we have to be prepared to do online only learning. That's the only one that we have to do. So, you know, remember that we were one of the 22 counties that was not taken out of lockdown immediately. And we certainly don't know what it's going to look like on Monday, August 24th. And so what they want you to do is they want you to be prepared so that if all children have to be online on August 24th, you are ready to go. But then they also want to give you the latitude as a community to say, if you would like to bring back some or all of your children, that's fine with them, but these are the things that you need to do in order to make that happen. And so maybe
They don't
that's a
want to be in
better
a
way to
position
describe it.
cancel in school anymore. I think that's some of it, right? I mean, they want
Right.
us to continue to do what locally works for us and what our current situation is. So they don't want to get in the role of having to cancel school for 2 weeks or a month. And I mean, that's the sense I've gotten from it, that they're wanting
And
to
they
give
want,
us flexibility to do that. So sorry, Steve.
and they want you to be prepared for another wave that rolls through in October, and now students are out of school. And if you've elected the hybrid option or the in-person option, they don't want you to get caught flat-footed and not be prepared to deal with those students when suddenly they're out of school for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, et cetera.
And is your sense, Steve, that they really are sincere in their desire to push a lot of this down to local control?
I would say yes. I was smiling only because it's been, I was going to use the word painfully apparent. It's been readily apparent. How about that? It's been readily apparent in the meetings with them that they understand that it is not even virtually, but completely impossible, given the staff that they have at the Department of Ed, to provide the level of direction that we need at the local level to make this work. And so that's why they've gone with what I would consider a compliance model. You know, you do agree, you know, and promise your firstborn, which is, by the way, essentially what Amy and Matt and I had to do on this current plan, that you will do these things. And there is a series of boxes that you say that you will do. For instance, you know, and Lisa's on the call, you know, you promise to adhere to the federal, state, and statutory requirements for special education. So you're going to do those things. They're not going to tell you how to do it. They're going to give you the latitude locally to determine how to do that, but they're going to require that you follow those rules. And so when you start thinking about, okay, how do I comply with a full LRE, a full least restrictive environment type of setting in the fall, that's why I said we may look at saying, well, special ed kids may need to be on campus, or some of our special education students may need to be on campus, because that's our best method of compliance with that. But then they also want us to be able to say, if there's a new wave that comes through in November and those kids can't be in the classroom, are you ready?
The only other thing I would add is come back to Janet's comment about that community input. We'll have to obviously be strategic on how we get that, right? And what are the questions we need to ask them, and what's a good use of their time, and how do we do that? Because we can't do some of the typical things we would have normally done to get that community input. And so whether that's inviting some to virtual meetings, or, you know, trying to push some questions out to the community to get some feedback on, I think we'll continue to consider and look at all those options, because like you said, I mean, we don't want to get behind on this. We have a chance to try to do some advanced planning on the work and to make sure we get some voices heard. So I think those are all great thoughts for us to consider.
Just have 3 quick questions, maybe. One, are you guys working with any local physicians, doctors, on your plans going forward, just to get their input on if we should be open, or what types of things we should be doing? The second question would be in regards to kindergarten. So maybe for Amy, like what the plans are for, like, you know, kindergarten roundup was canceled. A kindergartner coming into school for their first experience, that may be pretty tough to do virtually, if that's the case, starting in August. And then my third question was, is there a plan, or have you guys started to work on a plan of when you might look at reopening buildings, or even the central administration office, to people coming back to work there versus at home, or what that might look like, or if that's just done for this year and you're looking forward to August, or what?
So I'll start with the first one, and then I think I'll punt to Amy and then to Chase after that. So in your first question was how are we determining, again, in that that criteria that they've set up for us, that falls in the health and safety category that they're looking at. So Kate Callahan's been instrumental in working with our local emergency response team in Johnson County, and so she gets feedback from them. And we've been in contact with UIHC and Mercy as we've gone through this process. So as we get to the point where we're ready to develop those reopening processes, we certainly will have that opportunity to consult with medical professionals. We're also getting directives from the state on that. And so I presume that they are also from DHS. And so as we go through that process, I'm hoping that is all going to align such that we are given a uniform set of standards that can be applied, not just here, but what does it look like next door in Solon or in Clear Creek or in Lone Tree, so that we're using similar processes to determine when it's safe to have students back, and that when they're back, what are the processes that are safe. I can tell you that the team has been working hard to figure out how students can pick up materials at the end of the year. And that's been a large part of the discussion, is about how do you keep students and staff and families safe while they're having those interactions. And we are turning to healthcare professionals and best practices to get answers for those. So Amy, you want to provide some feedback on Kindergarten Roundup?
Yeah, so that's certainly been something that I've been thinking of, and not only for incoming kinders, but just all those natural transitions that we would have offered opportunities for. So our 6th graders up to 7th grade, 8th graders to 9th grade, and a lot of those transition opportunities didn't get to happen this year. So some things I've brainstormed, are things like, well, could we, well, of course, we could always reach back to our families through Zoom capabilities. And then you start thinking about, well, what do we naturally do during those times? We allow the students into the buildings. They get to see the different common areas and that sort of thing. But I think we have to be careful, just like for safety plans and why they're protected under Iowa code. We don't necessarily want video videotaping throughout the course of our buildings or a walkthrough in that way. So I think it really comes down to whether we're going to have any opportunity to be on site come August. If there's that possibility where we can do through some social distancing measures, then perhaps we could still do some things, offer some things like we had in the past. I think that's kind of the unknown. So while we might be planning for, these 3 different scenarios of return completely, hybrid model, or remote, that's all going to also dictate what we can do for these transition opportunities for our kids.
All right, Chase, you want to give them a quick update on the ops piece there?
Sure. So, Paul, there were a couple of different things in there. I think Steve actually alluded to one earlier. We have started working on a plan and have it pretty much finalized in terms of getting staff back in the buildings, just to kind of close down the buildings for the end of the school year, and putting a plan in place to get students to the buildings, more likely than not inside, but to the buildings to pick up things that they might need over the summer. We'll be sending communication out with a broad framework later this week on that, with follow-up from the principals to their school communities about what that might look like, both in terms of staff and student access to buildings here at the end of the school year. In terms of the overall framework and bringing people back to work, or when we might open our campuses, we're close to making some final decisions on that for at least the first part of the summer, if not all of the summer. We had targeted this week to get those communications out, and they should be out to both families and staff before the end of the week. To be honest with you, we're not in a rush to open up our campuses or to bring our staff back. As has been since March, health, wellness, and safety continue to be the priority. And so we're going to take those measures very seriously as we look at when we start bringing people back in some sort of format into the working environment, and start inviting people back onto our campuses. But we're going to look at what some of our municipal partners are doing. Obviously, we keep a close eye on what the university is doing here in our community. And so we're zeroing in on some of those decisions and we will have that communication out. I will tell you, and we've talked about this before, that we will continue our meal service program throughout the summer. We're consistently looking at that program, and so we are in a position where we can announce that we will continue to serve meals. However, the sites might be slightly different, and to hopefully avoid any confusion, we won't announce any changes to those sites until closer to the end of May. But we are happy to say that we are going to continue our grab and go meal program through the summer.
Good news.
Thanks, all.
Yeah,
So there'll be
I
much
did have
more
a-
to follow on that. And oh, go ahead.
Well, I had a question I was going to try and get in before we got into the whole return to learn plan. So I'm going to take a kind of a 90-degree turn here. And I don't know if this is for Diane or maybe even Adam. I was thinking about my son today was taking an AP test online. And I don't know how well that went because he was still doing it when I got on to my first call today. But my question is, do we have any way to know people had signed up to take AP tests and then they could have, backed off of it and not done it? I'm like, did we lose people because of this taking that? And the reason I ask is that, it has real world dollars to it, right? If you do well on AP tests, you can not, get some college credit and whatnot. And college is expensive. So I'm just curious, is there any way to assess this impact on that area of education?
I don't have those numbers, but we certainly can get those and share those with you.
And I know I had a kid taking an AP test today too, so I got kicked off Zoom in my house so that I didn't slow the internet connection down. So I don't know if that happened to you too. I had to do a bunch of meetings on my cell phone instead of on my Zoom. Maybe that's why our internet's so slow today, everyone, because all these kids are taking AP tests all over the country.
You should get Adam to help you with that, Steve.
My kid had enough technological knowledge to tell me to get off the internet. There'll be a lot more to follow, obviously, on this topic as we get rolling in it. It really is just in its infancy. They pushed it out last Friday, did their first webinar on it, did their first follow-up on it today. Given the Q&A that I saw, and Amy, if you saw anything else, feel free to jump in here. But given the first round of Q&A, there are a lot of people asking a lot of really good questions. Some of which the DE has clearly thought about, others are new to them. So I think we're going to get a lot more guidance and clarity here in the next couple weeks. And then back to Lisa's comment, which I think is really pertinent here, is this idea that we need to complete these compliances and these assurances by July 1st, but we don't have to have all of our plan nailed down until a little bit further on in the summer, which gives us not only the latitude to plan well, but also to make sure that we engage the right people in the conversation so that the plan is ready to go and supported by constituents before it's ready to roll out.
Thanks, Steve. Again, it's hard for me not being online and seeing kind of the body language, facial expressions. Are we nearing the end of this particular board item? More to come, obviously.
Lots more to come.
Are we ready to move on to the climate action plan?
I'll say yes from the faces that I'm reading.
I'm not hearing anything otherwise. Okay, let's move on to the climate action plan. Steve, are you taking this one too?
Yes. So one of the questions, and I believe JP was the first one to raise it, was where are we at with our discussion about solar power and in particular power purchase agreements? And I can tell you that we have continued to have fairly extensive conversations with two separate providers out there that are interested in working with the district. Chase was just approached by a third. We know that there's a fourth out there that has expressed some on again, off again interest in this over time. We think that the next best step in the process is to go back and revisit the issue of power purchase agreement itself. Again, what it is and how it works, and the impact that it has on the district. To that end, I've had some conversation with Attorney Holland, and he's putting some materials together. Presumes that he will have that out to you later this week for your review. And then likely need to get it back on the agenda because he's going to need to walk through it with you. For those of you that have been with us for a while, you know that the whole structure of a power purchase agreement has gone through some pretty significant evolutions at the state level through the legislature. And we want to make sure that we really understand how they work and what our role in it is. Probably the thing that causes the biggest concern as you look at a PPA is it's a long-term obligation on behalf of the district. Many of them are 25 years. And so really understanding what it is that we're obligating the district, future board members to, the community to in the long run, I think is a really good example of that, measure twice once option. And so Joe's going to give us first an overview of what is a PPA, what does it look like, how does it work, how might it be beneficial to the district and the community, are there any drawbacks to it? And then once he's gone through that process, then in conversation with him, we think that the next best step for us as a district is likely to go through something that would look like what you would consider to be a request for proposal. We usually call these requests for quotes when they're not mandated by state statute, but it gives us an opportunity to help spec out what a project would look like, and then get an understanding from those parties that are interested in whether or not they think they can meet those specifications, and what the cost and the parameters are that they would bring to such a project. So that's where we're at right now. Like I said, we've got at least two local entities very interested, a third one that has just contacted Chase, a fourth one that's been kind of in and out of the process of the dialogue over the past couple of years with this. They've gotten so far, just so you know, down the road, that they've started looking at rooftops and green spaces, and Les has been super helpful in getting them utility bills. Ben Grimm's on the call with us today. He's been super helpful at walking facilities with a couple of the groups so that they can actually see what our grounds look like, have a better understanding of what our roof spaces look like, although they have not been up on our roofs, but understand what they are. Dwayne's also on here because, of course, one of the things that Joe brought up right away when I was talking to him was understanding the implications for our facilities master plan, both in terms of things like cash flow, if you wanted to own the panels versus going through a PPA, and then what are the issues with infrastructure and everything from insurance policies on roofs to those types of things that'll come into play if we look at the various arrays on campuses. So that's where we're at right now. And like I said, Joe's latest email to me late this afternoon says that he's been compiling documents and research, and that he will have something preliminary to you, certainly for your next meeting, and hopefully well in advance of that.
So when we get into agenda setting, we can expect to talk about having an agenda item at the 19th to the 26th May meeting, maybe the 26th?
Yes. Yeah, I would say for sure by the 26th, and we may, actually, I guess the 19th is usually just our school closure meeting, so I think we'd plan on the 26th, and I think we'd put in the presentation section with the idea that Joe would have that opportunity to provide significant information to you about what a PPA is, how it works in Iowa under the new laws, and then the kinds of things that we should think about including in a request for quote.
Okay, perfect. Any questions for Steve on PPA?
No questions. Thanks for the update.
Okay. Okay, are we ready to move to agenda setting? Thumbs up,
Looks
yes,
like we
high
are.
fives. Okay, so agenda setting, we've got a P&G meeting on the 14th. We have a board retreat on May 16th with topics around review of our board goals for this year, kind of how we're doing. We'll talk about vision mission work kind of in conjunction with Battelle work that has been postponed till the fall. We want to get a discussion around, how we want to manage those two pieces of work. You just referenced the PPA potentially impact on facilities, Steve. So there's an item around reviewing kind of next steps around F&P 2.0. And then we'll round up the conversation around superintendent transition. I think Steve and Matt have been thinking through what that looks like, would like to share some information with us. And then we'll talk about board's intentions and goals around superintendent search. So we've got 2 hours this Saturday morning. It's a full agenda. I'll get the goals out in advance to everyone so you have that before. I'll try to get that out first thing tomorrow morning so you have a chance to review them before the meeting on Saturday, and that's what the agenda looks like. I think it's pretty full for 2 hours, but I think these are the things that are top of mind for us as we start thinking about what our priorities are going to be for our summer and school year coming up. Any questions on the board retreat coming up this Saturday? Hearing none. We also have a meeting on the 19th, which we just said was going to be another special board meeting, updates around our activity around learning operations, nutrition in our state right now, of school closure, any updates on return to learn. Then we also have an exempt session that we'll schedule before the board meeting to get an update from Chase on matters related to our negotiations that are underway with a number of our groups. So anything else directors would like to see for the 19th beyond the exempt session and what we have for our special board meeting?
President Godwin, we missed setting the public hearing for the budget amendment on tonight. So if we could get that on the 19th, I would appreciate that very much, please.
Perfect. Kim, did you catch that? Public hearing, budget amendment?
Yes, I got
Anything else? Going once, going twice. Again, I feel like I'm just I'm flying just without all my tools, not being able to see folks. So I think we're good. I would like to say before we call our meeting to adjourn, congratulations to Carolyn Steinar for moving into our new role of principal at Hoover Elementary starting July 1st. That's exciting, and would like to welcome Carolyn into that new role. And again, just wish Dennis well as he's retiring at the end of the school year. So anything else directors would like to mention for the good of the cause and our district this evening before we adjourn? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thanks, Charlie and JP. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. Thanks, folks. Appreciate your time tonight. Apologies for the internet issues. Look forward to talking with everyone on Saturday, and good luck from P&G Group meeting here in a couple of days. Talk to everyone soon. Take care.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks, Janet.
Good night, folks.